Hello, this is Oliver or Prava from Jesus Cracked. I'm making a video for you guys today where we are going to discuss bolt textures. We are going to discuss how we can analyze them and how we can think about ranges when we are playing them as the pre-flop raiser. The situation that we are going to assume when we're looking at these hands is that we are in, say, under the gun plus one. We're playing against an unknown player. He has a full stack. We're 100 BBs deep, and he has position on us on the flop. He called us pre-flop from the button. So we're going to look at the range of hands that we can expect him to call a c-bet with, and use that information to figure out how we want to play the turn and river. Now, on this first bolt texture here, our perceived strength is good. And the reason that it's good is because there's a king out there. The king is a prime member of our perceived opening range pre-flop. The bolt texture is dry. But if we look at the range of hands that are willing to call a c-bet on this kind of bolt texture, there are some strong hands, the king x hands and the sets. There are some weaker hands, pocket jacks, 10s, 7s, 6s, 9s, and some 8x hands and some 5x hands that are probably going to peel a c-bet on this kind of bolt texture. The reason that villain is calling with these hands when we fire a c-bet is because he bluff catches. Say he could see that we had something like ace-king, he would probably not call with these hands because what would the point be? So when he calls, it is to bluff catch. The difference between bluff catching and floating is that when we float, we have no showdown value. When we bluff catch, we have a made hand with showdown value. At least that's how I think about it. There are probably some people who are using the terminology in a slightly different way, but that's not so important. What is important here is to understand the composition of villain's range on the turn. If you look at it, I wrote it down here in the notepad. He has some strong hands, some weak hands, and a single draw. Because there are only this one draw that's possible in this bolt texture, I would generally describe this range that villain has on the turn as inelastic. Furthermore, I would classify it as strong-weak. It has a strong part and a weak part. Because there are a lot of possible weak hands in that range, all the hands that we have down here, this is a good bolt texture to double barrel. Simply because the reason he called with all these hands on the flop was in order to figure out, okay, do we really have a king? Now, some players will not have that many weak hands in their range. They are set minors, they just call hoping to hit. They never call here with, say, something like pocket 7s, pocket 6s, and they just snap fold them. So their weak range is obviously a little bit tighter, a little bit smaller on the turn. And that makes this bolt texture slightly less optimal to double barrel. But against most players, this is a phenomenal bolt texture to double barrel. Now, the worst hand that I would probably bet for value on the turn would be a hand like King-Queen. The reason that I would not c-bet the turn for value with King-Jack is because what do I hope for? What do I expect to get called by? When I bet the turn here and I get called, there's a very good chance that villain either has a set or has a better king. In other words, I'll be value cutting myself. Now, if I check the turn, villain now has all these hands in his range, and if he decides to bet, I'm going to be pretty happy check calling here with King Jack. Simply because there is a fair chance that villain is just trying to take the pot down now that it looks like I have given up. If we move on to the next bolt texture, maybe before we move on, we should talk a little bit about point of honesty here. Because there are so many weak hands that villain can call with on this ball taster. So many second pair type hands. We should expect for most players that the point of honesty will be on a turn. So if we bet the flop, villain is going to call with a lot of hands that are bluff catching, but on the turn he's probably going to fold the vast majority of his bluff catchers. Let's move on to the next ball texture here and talk a little bit about that one. Now, this is a similar yet very different ball texture. There is now a flush draw. There are also straight draws on this board texture. Our perceived strength as the preflop raiser on this board texture here is still good. There's a queen, there's a 10. Both of them are members of our perceived opening range preflop. If we write down the range of hands that we can expect villain to either call or raise with on the flop, it will be something like Queen X. It will be something like pocket threes and something like pocket tens. The weak hand the villain will have in his range here would be something like pocket jacks. It would be something like 10x, where 10x are hands like 10-9, Jack-10, Ace-10. Furthermore, there are flush draws and there are straight draws like Jack-9 suited, can have a hand like King-Jack, Ace-Jack, and if he does not, 3-bet Ace-King preflop, potentially also Ace-King. Now, as you can see, the composition of villain's calling range on this board texture here is very, very different from the one we had just before. Villain's range here on the turn is elastic, meaning that depending on our bet sizing on the turn, we may or may not get villain to fold some of his hands. I expect most players to raise hands, the top of the strong hands, ace queen, pocket threes, and pocket tens directly on the flop when we fire c-bet. The reason is that they don't want action killers or the flush draw to get there on the turn. They want the money to go in now on the flop while they're ahead. There are not that many weak hands here. It's limited to pocket jacks and some 10x hands that he might call with. And then we have the draws. Some of these draws, for example, the king jack without the flush draw, the ace jack without the flush draw, the ace king without the flush draw, are all pretty weak hands that are definitely folding if we fire again here on the turn. Now, but there are not that many of them. Well, this depends on the range of hands that villain calls with preflop. So the vast majority of the draws that we will be facing on the turn are the flush draws. So when we are deciding what to do on the turn, we should be thinking about what we can achieve. When we're firing a bet on this flop and we get called, it's, I think to most of you, obvious that the range that villain is proceeding with on this board sector here is slightly better than on the second board sector. And that also means that the turn is a little worse a spot to double barrel. If we're betting the turn here, we're never getting him to fold a queen, and unless that we bet really big on the turn, he's probably also not folding a flush draw. If we bet really big on the turn, though, we can get most of his hands to fold, simply because it's only truly the Queen X hands that can withstand a lot of heat. And the flush draws, they have so bad implied odds on the turn that they will have to fold. But if we say have something like ace queen here ourselves, and we bet the flop and we get called, we should think about how we can make the most money here. If we bet again on the turn and villain folds, we take the pot down, so be it. But it's very likely that we actually have the best hand, so we should bet an amount where villain is willing to make a mistake. And since villain here on the turn has something around 20%, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less equity against our hand, we can get away with betting something around half pot. And if villain there then calls, he's making a mistake. If he folds, he's not making a mistake. So in order to allow our opponent to make mistakes, we should generally be betting a little bit smaller here on the turn, because we actually do want to get called by villain draws. So the range of hands that I'm betting here on the turn are hands that have some showdown value. If I'm on a bluff here, say I'm a semi-bluff and I have the flush draw myself, I'll be betting slightly bigger, because there I want him to fold, say hands like the 10x, and I want him to fold the flush draws that may be better than mine, and that leaves him with the Queen X range on the river, against which I have the best implied odds. So you can say that if we bet here on the turn according to our actual hand, we have a tell. That is true. And against players that we're playing against day out and day in, we will probably end up with some compromise where we end up firing a little over a half pot bet on the turn, and sometimes check raising, simply because we want to look like that we're giving up. We'll be playing a little more tricky trappy here on the turn. But against most players, we can get away with actually betting according to the hand that we have, and by choosing and betting in an amount that allows us to mold the range of hands that villain calls with. And this is a fundamental assumption, that the bet sizing actually determines the range of hands that villain is likely or happy to call with, because the bet sizing sets the price for villain to continue in the hand. Now, some of you may say that flush draws, etc., sometimes raising this flop. There cannot be that many flush draws here, and that is probably true. Aggressive players on this kind of board texture actually raise this flop quite frequently, and there we'll just have to fold. Not much we can do there. So let's talk a little bit about bluffing this board texture here. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful board texture to fire a single bet at, because there are so many pocket pairs between the 3 and a 10 that are not going to be calling us. On the other hand, it's a terrible, terrible, terrible board texture to fire a double barrel at, unless that we have some showdown value. Simply because with a double barrel, let would say pocket 8s or something like Jack 10, we are ahead of some of his hands that he's willing to call with, and we can there leverage the elasticity in villain's range. If we are betting the turn here as a pure bluff, if we say have a semi-bluff, we should probably also be betting the river. But again, we can, by flexing our bet sizing on a turn, probably get him to fold a lot of the hands that have good equity against us by choosing a bet size that's on the bigger side. Yeah, I think that's it about this board texture. Obviously, if you have any questions whatsoever, just let me know. Now, one thing I want to talk about here is whether or not this is a good board texture to fire a barrel at if the flush draw gets down the turn. Now, because there are not that many weak hands, and because there are not that many straight draws in villain's range, it's actually pretty bad. The vast majority of the draws that are in here are the flush draws. This though depends a little on how often he's going to peel with hands like King Jack offsuit, Ace Jack offsuit on this board texture here. He may or may not be peeling with them on the flop, tainted outs, etc. If he's peeling with these hands on the flop, it is a good idea to bluff on the flush cards. If not, it's a terrible idea. And here there are no magic bullets. No way that we can just look at the board texture and look at magic numbers and hold the manager and then play accordingly. We have to pay attention to the range of hands that villain calls within certain spots in order to draw our own little mental image of how this player plays post flop. Let's take a couple of more board textures here before I call this an example video. Oh, we have here a monotone board texture. Now, monotone board textures is actually, well, they are pretty hard to play. First of all, there are very few hands that can continue if they face a lot of heat on this board texture. Simply because there are very few hands that are strong enough. No, there's free to flush. Looks pretty damn scary. Here there's even some more coordination, so there are also some straight draws out there, but that's not that important. The important fact here is that it's monotone. So if we are c-betting these board textures here a lot, and we're playing against some observant opponents, they'll start playing back at us. On the other hand, we can probably categorize poker players into two categories here. The ones that bluff a lot on monotone boards and the ones who don't. If we look at villain's range for continuing here, it will be something like Queen X, pocket sevens, pocket tens. It would be pocket jacks and some 10x, some not that many 10x hands in his range, and obviously some more flush draws. Will be something like probably something like King Jack with a club, and be something like Ace Jack with a club. And be something like I think we should include pocket nines with a club, and then obviously made hands we should write out here made flushes. So it's a very, very narrow range of hands that are willing to continue here. And that means that unless that we know that villain is bluff catching a lot on monotone board textures, the turn is a terrible, terrible spot to double barrel. Most players have a point of honesty that's pretty early in the hand on these monotone boards that is directly on the flop. Some are bluffing and floating and bluff raising these board textures a lot, and there's nothing that we can do other than pay attention. So our range here, when we're betting this board texture here, will probably be something like ace queen. I can see myself check calling here with pocket jacks with no club, generally just trying to get it to showdown. Pretty happy with playing a small part against most players. If we bet here and we're playing against an aggressive opponent and we get raised, and we have pocket jacks here, we don't know if we have the best hand or he has the best hand, and since we have no redraw, we will have to fold. So therefore it will be a pretty good spot for us to check call, because it looks like we're just giving up. Because if we had a hand, we'll probably bet this flop here. And so we're checking a little bit for deception, and for equity protection if we have jacks here. I personally, when I play, pay a lot of attention to how my opponents are playing monotone board textures and what tendencies that they have. It is also one of the things that I, Hold'em Manager, will look for when I'm trying to figure out how a certain player plays. Simply because it is nice to know, or nice to at least save some dollars, that if we have air and then we, against some players it's a no-brainer c-bet. Against other players it's a no-brainer check fold, because we're getting rebluffed here too frequently to continue. So monotone board textures are probably the board textures where I think that having a read on our opponent is the most important thing. Now here, when we're playing against an unknown, I will at smaller stakes assume that they're pretty honest, and at mid stakes assume that they're pretty dishonest, and at mid stakes and high stakes it becomes a lot more dependent on game flow and whether or not it's Wednesday or Thursday, beginning of the month, end of the month, and generally your image. What do they think of you? Are you tight weak or perceived to be tight weak or whatnot? So there, it's more of a feel, and because the players are capable of adjusting. At smaller stakes, I would assume that people are pretty honest, and that may or may not be the case in all small stakes games, but I think a fair chunk of them, people are generally pretty honest. Now let's take the last board texture here. It's the ace 5-6 two-tone flop. Our perceived strength on this board texture here is good. There's an ace. We have a good chunk of aces in our perceived opening range pre-flop. But there are also a lot of draws on this board texture here. There are flush draws, straight draws, and villain has potential sets and two pairs in his range. So this is a board texture where, because our perceived strength is pretty good, and because villain can actually rep a good chunk of hands if he raises here, that this is a board texture where we get check raised and bluff raised a fair amount of the time, because this is exactly how villain would play a strong hand if he had one. And he's using the fact that we are probably c-betting this board texture here a little bit too much against us. So, but let's look at the range of hands that are going to be calling us here. There are obviously some ace-x hands, and here I kind of merge both calling and re-raising. Most players find it pretty easy to deal if they get raised here, because what can they do? If they have air, it's pretty simple. And if this opponent is not bluffing a lot, there's no reason to bluff catch, so they just fold, even a hand as strong as ace-king. But if this villain is bluffing a lot, they'll not fold and they won't bluff catch with ace-king. So, but let's look at it. We will have something like nut flush draws and pocket sixes, pocket fives, and 6-5, and hands like ace-5, ace-6 suited. Now, the weak hands are going to call us here on this board texture here. Here, we made hands would be something like pocket jacks till pocket sevens, and maybe something like 7-6. Maybe, well, that'll probably be it. And the draws that are out there as flush draws. I put the nut flush draw up here because the nut flush draw on this board texture here is pair plus a draw, so it's a strong combo draw. But other flush draws and something like 8-6, 8-7 suited, and something like 9-8 suited, and maybe if he has 3-4 suited in his calling range, he will also have them here. So, depending on the player type, we'll be facing a a range that has these hands in with different frequencies on the turn. A passive guy, he will have almost all these hands in his range on the turn. A more aggressive guy, he will have a high frequency of the weak hands on the turn, because the strong hands he will be raising on the flop together with some of the draws. So his range on the turn is weaker, and we should therefore be more tempted to fire a double barrel. That being said, it requires a read for us to double barrel here, because he could also be slow playing a little bit. Not that I think that's the case, but it happens. At small stakes and mid stakes against aggressive players, I'll be more tempted to double barrel here. At higher mid stakes and high stakes games, I'll be less tempted, because these players, they understand that they will look pretty weak if they just call here, because if they had a strong hand, they will be raising the flop. So when they just call, they can never have a strong hand. So they're using the fact that by just calling, that they're capping their range. It's hard for them to have a strong hand. This is not something that small stakes players think much about. So when they just call us here on this kind of board chaser, they actually do cap their range, and they're generally pretty weak on the turn. So this is a board chaser that's pretty good to double barrel against small stakes players. Villain's range here on the turn, the elasticity depends on his tendencies a lot. If he's an aggressive player, he has a strong weak range, where the strong part are the ace-x bluff catcher, something like ace-10, and these weak hands that he just called with on the flop. And that means that it's a pretty damn good spot for us to double barrel. Against a player who is calling more here, not raising flush draws, etc., villain's range is elastic on the turn, and we can use that to our advantage. First of all, we can, against most of them, expect them to raise the strong draws on the strong hands on the flop. So if we have a hand like ace jack, ace queen, we should probably be betting for value and protection on the turn. And since villain here is likely to fold if we bet really big, we want to bet a little bit smaller. So a little over half pot here on a turn is a pretty good bet sizing. At smaller stakes, I would probably be betting a little bit bigger, because there are people seems to be chasing their flush draws a little more than they do at mid stakes poker. Some mid stakes players here will bluff shove the turn, but that is something that you learn pretty quickly, and there you just need to make up your mind whether or not they ever have a strong hand, because most of them, they actually just raise the strong hands on the flop. So when they bluff shove, they have either a weak flush draw or some weak made hand that they decide to turn into a bluff. So yeah, I guess this was the last board texture here that I wanted to talk about. So if you have any questions, or you want me to do more of this, or you have your own videos that you want me to look at, don't be afraid. Just post it, ask me, ship me an email, ask in the headquarters, and I'll be more than happy to help you out. So this was Oliver and Prava from Deuces Cracked, with a small video on different board textures and how we can play them.